In today's lecture, I'm going to, of course, like I said, talk about the Cold War era, which goes from like the 1940s up to the 1990s. So I'm kind of I don't know if I have time really to talk much about what happens after that post-Cold War era, but that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today, which really starts maybe around 1947, kind of ends like around the Persian Gulf War and fall of the Berlin Wall. It's kind of about when I guess the Cold War kind of ended in the world. So anyway, let me go ahead and, of course, talk a little today, of course, about the Cold War era. The Cold War era starts really in the 1940s, like right after World War II ended. Here's kind of a little, I guess, synopsis of what I guess the Cold War was about. But you can obviously see, like they said, of course, that little short introductory video, that it was a confrontation that occurred, really a geopolitical struggle that happened between the United States and the Soviet Union. Lasted about, I guess, roughly 40, 50 years. So kind of the date of when it starts kind of is debated. I think usually 1947 is sometimes seen as the date of when it is. And the Cold War almost caused World War III. That's one thing they kind of mentioned about in the video, about how the fact that both sides began stockpiling nuclear weapons, and so it could have led to World War III breaking out. And there, I'll get to later. There's numerous occasions, maybe 3 or 4 times I know during the Cold War, when we almost had nuclear war that broke out between both sides, and you had this East-West split, where you had 2 different sides that were basically in the whole Cold War. It wasn't just U.S. versus the Soviet Union. It was like all their different allies that they had. But you had on one side, you had the U.S. and all the allied countries in the West, like Western Europe and all that, which were all pro-capitalist, pro-democrat. They were often called the Western Bloc. And yet Soviet Union, all these communist states like in Europe, Eastern Europe, they were part of the so-called Eastern Bloc. Of course, you also had countries that were in, like Asia, North Korea, North Vietnam, People's Republic of China. They were all communist also as well. The term Cold War, I don't know if you know much about it. There's different theories on where the term came from, but I think there's one theory that George Orwell, you may have heard of, who was a famous British novelist, coined it in the 1940s. Some kind of newspaper article. And Orwell was very famous for books like 1984 or Animal Farm, which criticized, communism, the negative aspects of it, and so on. Now, there was another issue that they think helped, lead into the Cold War, which was the founding of the United Nations, which was founded right after World War II ended. There's the United Nations building that you can see there. And it was formed in 1945, originally in San Francisco, but they later moved the headquarters of the UN to what is New York City, where you see the now famous UN building that's there. And it was like a similar organization to the League of Nations that kind of had folded after World War II, which didn't really work. And it was founded by the 5 winning allies in the war. They were later called the Big Five. U.S., Britain, France, China, and of course in the Soviet Union, now Russia, and it included like a General Assembly that was part of it. They have this thing called the Security Council, if you know about the United Nations, which basically maintains a lot of the policies of the UN. And the Security Council, the 5 permanent members on it were the Big Five. So all those 5 countries I told you about, U.S., Britain, France, China, Soviet Union, or Russia, basically had the most power in it. And they have like also 10 other alternating countries that are kind of part of it every year that are there. But they say what part of caused the Cold War to break out, they think, the 1940s, is the fact that the Big Five have like this veto power thing, if you know about it, where they can veto each other, like resolutions or whatever, in the UN. And it caused a lot of strain in the Cold War between both sides. U.S., Britain, France, versus, Soviet Union, China. That was kind of part of the reasons for, why it all happened. So that's one thing, they talk about the fact that the UN, helped to kind of cause a lot of, issues as well. I don't have a map of, I can kind of show you a map of this, which is right here as well. But if you look at this map here, it's kind of a Cold War map of Europe, I guess, and all that. But you also start to see another thing that happened too, which helped to cause the Cold War as well. The fact the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe. So they converted all these different countries to communism: Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria. All those areas were basically communist. Yugoslavia was too for a while, but they were aligned with the West and all that. And so that's another thing that they think helped to cause the Cold War, was the fact that Eastern Europe was going communist. And if you study about the Prime Minister of Britain, I think he wasn't in power at the time, who was Winston Churchill. Churchill, 1946, came to the United States in where's Missouri. He was giving this lecture where Harry S. Truman was president at the time. I think he was president there. And he commented about the fact that Eastern Europe was going communist, and he called it the so-called Iron Curtain. And so that was the term they often used during the Cold War to describe the Eastern Bloc areas that were all communist. And so that was a major issue of what, helped to cause basically, I guess, the beginning of the Cold War. But they often talk about the big thing that they think really helped to cause the Cold War, so-called East-West split, was what happened to Germany after the war. What happened to Germany being, about this occupied and divided after the war, it was a major cause of why the Cold War happened. It really was. And of course, as you know, what happened was they divided up Berlin too. The capital of Germany was actually divided too into like a West and East Berlin. And you can see here what happened was the British, the French, and the United States, they occupied like the western part of Germany in 3 zones. You can see there green, blue, and I guess orange in those colors. And then the Soviet Union occupied that red area, which became East Germany. So you can see East Germany is a little smaller compared to the other areas. And so what happens over time is that they also divided Berlin too. Berlin was divided too. You had a West Berlin and an East Berlin. West Berlin was, occupied by the West, Britain, France, U.S., and then East Berlin was divided, of course, by the Soviet Union. You can see it right here in the map, but there's Berlin in East Germany. It was really an odd thing. It was about, the Cold War that happened. And it was kind of controversial because a lot of people would actually, that were in the Eastern Bloc areas, like behind the Iron Curtain, would actually go to East Berlin to try to get out, to go into West Berlin. So they'd actually cross over. And so that's why they later built, if you know about it, the whole Berlin Wall, etc. So you had West Germany on one side was this capitalist democratic state, right? Backed by the West, especially the U.S. And then you had the East Germany, of course, which was the communist state, of course, which was backed by the Soviets and all that. And they actually had real names, like West Germany was called actually the Federal Republic of Germany, and in East Germany was called the German Democratic Republic. Those are actual the real names that they were called. And they're divided for about, by the way, around 40 years, the two states. So it's one of the big issues that really helps to really cause, the Cold War. There's some other things that happened too in the Cold War, which the Cold War actually started when Harry S. Truman was president of the United States. And then Joseph Stalin was the ruler of the Soviet Union. So those are the two main rulers that were there. Some other issues that were very famous during the Cold War era, they had what is called the Truman Doctrine, something the United States came out with, a new foreign policy idea That was an idea to try to contain communism from spreading, like throughout the world, something the United States starts doing in the 1950s. And we did this through giving aid to foreign powers that they might think that might be threatened by communism. So we gave aid to like Greece, Turkey, and then we started giving aid, economically, military aid to Western Europe. So that led to the so-called Marshall Plan that came about 1948 to 51. Also called the Economic Recovery Plan was the original name of it, but it was named after George C. Marshall, who was the Secretary of State under Harry S. Truman on the U.S., and they gave like something like $12-13 billion to Western Europe to help them get back on their feet after the war. So the United States practically helped rebuild a lot of cities in Europe, like Rome, Paris, London, etc. Some of them were damaged by the war, and so it's part of the reason why I think communism didn't really spread to the West, also as well. We offered it to the Eastern Bloc countries, but Stalin refused to take the money and all that were aid. Then, of course, the big thing that they talk about that helped cause really, they think the Cold War also to break out was over Germany with Berlin that occurred. What happened was in 1948-49, Stalin tried to blockade West Berlin, prevent people from getting out or anything getting in. And so he was trying to push the Western powers, France, U.S., and Britain, out of West Berlin. They wanted to control the whole thing because it's in East Germany. And so what happened, it was very famous, if you know about this. It's one of the really first big things that happens in the whole Cold War was the Western powers respond with what was called the Berlin Airlift, which you can see there. It's done between 1948 to 49. And what happened was the Western powers flew a bunch of sorties between, I guess, West Germany into West Berlin to bring in aid, so it wouldn't fall, to the Soviets in communism. That's a very famous picture. Anyway, one of the first famous pictures ever taken, I think, during the Cold War era, where that famous planes coming in into West Berlin. And they flew like something like over 200,000 sorties trying to bring in aid to help West Berlin, and it worked. And Stalin eventually lifted the blockade. They do believe that the blockade, if you know about this, led to eventually the formation of these two rival alliances. Afterwards, you got the formation of NATO. That's founded afterwards, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a intergovernmental alliance that was formed in Western Europe. North America now involves around 30 countries, but it was initially formed to prevent possibly the Soviet Union invading the West, attacking them. It was basically like a military alliance, really, more than anything. It even had NATO forces that were part of it. Its headquarters is in Brussels, Belgium, still today. And so you have that form. And all those areas you see in green are countries that are part of NATO today. So U.S., Canada, Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Austria, Italy, Germany, Greece, Turkey, etc. So all those are all countries that are in it. Of course, I think Poland's in it now, too, I believe. So now I guess it's all aligned against Russia in the East, which is kind of a threat, I think, to some of these countries like in Central Eastern Europe, like especially Poland, etc. So yeah, that's basically, and of course, what happened, if you know about it, was the Eastern Bloc then basically created their own alliance against the Western Bloc, which became the so-called Warsaw Pact, formed in 1955, which the Soviets were behind. So that included Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. You can see them all in the red areas there that are all in it. So all those countries are in it. Yugoslavia was communist too, but they were aligned with the West and were not in it. And the guy that was the head of Yugoslavia during that time, Tito, I think his name was, hated Stalin. They didn't like each other, all that. So those are some of the initial things that really, caused the Cold War to actually start initially, like in the 1940s at that point. All right, let me also talk about a few other things that were big moving on to the 1950s. Now, the other big thing that happened too as well was you had this thing where there was a fear of communism that started, people started kind of getting fearful of it in Europe, fearful of it in America, and it became known as the so-called Second Red Scare in the United States. And it was caused by different things. One was the Soviet Union expanding. That was one thing. Also, the fact that the Soviet Union was also getting nuclear weapons. I think by 1949, the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. Also, by 1952, both had the hydrogen bomb, which I think we first tested it in the Pacific, so-called Operation Ivy Mike, I think it is, where first fusion bomb was developed by Edward Teller, who was a famous Hungarian-American physicist. And the hydrogen bomb was like 1,000 more times powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So both had this bomb, and so both were, pretty. Obviously, the East and the West was creating a lot of tensions, especially when the Soviets started launching, satellites in space and all that. Hey, good morning, Hope. What's going on? So that's definitely it. And I think at the time when Harry S. Truman was president, if you know about this late 1940s and 1950s, they started putting people on trial for being communists. You don't think of much of that anymore today. I think they've got a lot of people that are kind of like that today, or anarchists or whatever, that are out there. But there are all these witch hunts that happen, of course, in America, where people basically were put on trial for being a communist. I think they had the so-called McCarthy hearings, if you know about that. They call it McCarthyism, where people were put on trial and they would, of course, be grilled on whether they were communist. And what people would do often was that they would say basically that they would take the Fifth Amendment. Are you a communist? I take the Fifth Amendment. wouldn't want to say it. And so a lot of people got blackballed, fired from their jobs, for being communist. And I think there's still people like that are radical in the government today. I think some people think there are, that might be there, maybe Chinese, might be spying on us and all that, probably. But so you had that that was going on. I think there were some other issues I'll mention. They had the Rosenbergs I sometimes mention about, where they had spies in the government where they gave atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. And I think the Rosenbergs were later put to death for it. They were executed, I think in 1951. I think 1951 is, I think, when they were basically put on trial for it, and they were put to death in 1953 for giving away atomic secrets. They also had the Alger Hiss trial. You heard of that one? 1950, where there was some kind of man that was in the U.S. State Department was accused of spying for the Soviet Union, and there was a big trial over that too. And I think even the House of Representatives, they had this thing called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, called HUAC, where they did the same thing like McCarthy did, grilling people, for being, communists, trying to investigate people for that overall. So that's the kind of stuff that was kind of going on, in the United States at the time. But the big things that they really, I think affected people the most was the fact that in Asia, you had countries that were starting to go communist, such as the People's Republic of China. In 1949, Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader of China, defeated Chiang Kai-shek's forces and took Beijing and all that. And so that led to the so-called People's Republic of China forming, which, of course, is Communist China that'll be in power still today. So if you know about Chiang Kai-shek, he was forced to flee China to Taiwan, where they created the Republic of China of Taiwan that's there now, which is controversial today because Chinese want Taiwan. The U.S. backs, of course, Taiwan. Mao Zedong was kind of controversial. If you know about it, he converted all of China to communism. Like they call it Maoism, I think they dubbed it, which was like a peasant form of communism that they had. And he had this thing called the Great Leap Forward, where they tried to industrialize China and collectivize all their farming. And it led to like millions of people dying. Like they're not sure how many died in China of like starvation or whatever, but it was kind of like what happened in Soviet Union as well. You had this cultural revolution too that they had as well, where they tried to basically eliminate pretty much any kind of people that were against this regime. They were kind of anti-communist and all that. They also had the domino theory. That was another thing too that was kind of popular too in the 50s and 60s. And it was a theory that if one country in Asia went communist, they would all go communist. And so people start to think that it's kind of an issue where we might have to intervene. And so that's what led to like the Korean conflict we were in, the Vietnam War conflict that we were in all that. So yeah, that's the other thing, of course, I'll talk about today, which was a major conflict that happened, of course, in, of course, the Cold War, which was the so-called Korean War, which happened between 1950 and 1953. The Korean conflict was an example of the Cold War heating up. It was considered like a proxy war that was fought between communist and non-communist forces. Of course, the United States backed by the UN on one side. And then you had on the other side, you had like, North Korea that was communist. And then they were backed by the Soviets, Chinese, etc. And the reason why the Korean War happened, if you know about this, was that if you remember correctly, before the Korean War happened, going back to like World War II and before World War II, Japan controlled Korea, the whole peninsula, but they left. If you know about this. And what happened was the Soviet Union and the United States created these two opposing states, one called North Korea and then one called South Korea. North Korea was communist. South Korea was democratic. I'll put the stuff on the screen for you if you want. But basically, the real name of North Korea is actually called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was founded in 1948. Capital at Pyongyang, of course. The guy that founded it, by the way, was Kim Il-sung. He was the dictator that controlled it for a bunch of years. He was the one that basically is the grandfather of the current ruler, Kim Jong-un, the one we have a lot of problems with. Rocket Boy, I think they call him, or Fat Boy. Somebody called Fat Boy, or something like that. But basically, yeah, that's basically his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, that founded it. They think they were kind of backed by the Soviets, who gave them a lot of military equipment also as well. Then South Korea was actually called the Republic of Korea. It's also founded in 1948. And it's democratic, capitalist, backed by the United States especially. And it had a president, its first president was Syngman Rhee. So it's kind of the two differences. And if you look at a map of course, of Korea, the Korean War, which is right here, you can see how the Korean peninsula was actually divided at the 38th parallel. That's something that's very famous, where they have like a later DMZ that's put between them. That's right there. And so today it's still a hot war, kind of somewhat, because the war never officially ended between them. What caused the whole thing to break out? Well, they believe that Joseph Stalin egged on North Korea to invade South Korea is what happened. So back with Soviet equipment, pretty much, like Soviet tanks and all that, the North Koreans invaded basically South Korea, July 1950, and that's what caused the Korean War to break out, which was actually a pretty bloody war. The United States would lose a lot of people in the war. I think we had 54,000 Americans killed in Korea, if you know about this. And what happened was the North Koreans actually at one point routed the South Koreans. If you look at this map here I've got showing, I guess, the whole progress of the war, you can see how one point, the North Koreans would actually push into what is basically South Korea. They actually got all the way down to where Busan is on the bottom. And I think that other map was actually better if I blow it up the other way. You can kind of see it right here. But that will kind of show it. But it's kind of working earlier. But anyway, yeah, that basically was what started the war. And what happened was the UN intervened. They came in and they got the United States mostly to put up like the bulk of the forces to save South Korea from being overrun, because they think that the object of the North Koreans was to basically unify Korea as one state, but a communist state, obviously. So Douglas MacArthur, who was, I think at the time, occupying Japan after World War II, brought in forces and they intervened in 1950, Battle of Incheon. And so what happened was the U.S. with the UN forces took back what is Seoul. But what happened was after the UN invaded into North Korea, the war stalemated between 1951 to 1953. Neither side's really able to win, and it was because the Chinese came in the war. They backed the North Koreans, and this caused the war to be very bloody. Korea was also the terrain was very mountainous. You know about that. And of course, very cold winters. And they had TV shows like MASH, of course, been made. You know about that, about the Korean War and all that. But neither side was able really to win the war. And so in 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States, he kind of got both sides to eventually sign kind of an armistice to end the war. And so both basically end the war at the 38th parallel, where it is, of course, today. And things still haven't changed, I think, since. I think there's attempts, to kind of alleviate and bring, the two countries together. But both, it's kind of odd. You got North Korea that's communist, South Korea that's democratic capitalist. And they're still at odds with each other, of course, today. So that was a major, hot conflict that, of course, occurred. Now I'll get to later Vietnam. That was the other one that they had too, of course, that was also famous in the Cold War. All right, let me move on and talk about a few other things that were kind of famous. They also had this other thing that happened that's famous in the Cold War era. Soviet Union had a new leader that came to power around 1953 or so, which was Nikita Khrushchev. He died. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and so Khrushchev came in. He was the ruler for like around 10 years. And Khrushchev, basically what he did was he became famous for eliminating a lot of the hardliner policies of Stalin. The cult of personality, they got rid of the gulags and things like that. And so there was this relaxation of tensions, in, of course, the Soviet Union with the West. This became known as de-Stalinization, as they nicknamed it later in the Cold War. It was also called, by the way, the Khrushchev thaw. Was often what it was called. Sometimes called Khrushchev kind of Stalin light. He's kind of like Stalin, but not as bad. And so what happened was it led to a lot of easing of tensions a little bit between the East and the West. Soviet Union even tried to meet with the United States. In fact, Khrushchev in 1959 actually came to the United States and visited this country when Eisenhower was president. It's a very famous thing that, of course, occurred. So he was trying to reach out and trying to prevent, maybe what could be a World War III, between these two countries, superpowers. And so, it inspired a lot of people, even in Eastern Europe, to try to get more rights and all that. And they had this thing called the Hungarian Revolution that occurred because of it. Like in Hungary, college students started trying to get new freedoms, which the Hungarian government started to push at that point in 1956 because of de-Stalinization and all that. And so Eventually, it caused the Hungarian Revolution to break out, which lasted about 2 weeks, not long. And what happened was the Hungarians revolted and pushed the Soviet armies that were in Hungary out at that point. And so that led to this nationwide revolution that went on from October 23rd to November 10th, 1956. And Khrushchev, who was in power, realized that if Hungary fell to democracy or even capitalism, that might be the end of the Soviet Union, because it might lead to all the spreading throughout Eastern Europe. And so, what happened, the Soviets came back in November. They crushed it. They crushed the Hungarian Revolution. Over 3,000 people were killed, and they tried to get aid from us. I think there was even a case where some of the Hungarians even went on national radio or something and pleaded for help with the West. But we couldn't do anything about it, or it would have been World War III, which would have broken out. So that was kind of an issue. So that was one thing that could have caused World War III. It was that issue right there. Also, they had between us and Khrushchev, they had the so-called Suez Crisis that occurred in Egypt, where the Republic of Egypt, under the president Gamal Nasser, seized what is the Suez Canal, which had been originally built, I think, by the French and the British back in the late 19th century. They wanted to nationalize it and control it. And what happened was France, Britain, and also the state of Israel basically intervened in what became known as the Suez Crisis. They actually seized the canal and actually bombed it and took over the Sinai Peninsula with their militaries. It's considered like some of the last hurrahs of the British Empire, by the way, before it kind of starts collapsing at that point in the post-Cold War era. And the Soviets threatened, by the way, to basically go to war, like World War III, if they don't withdraw their forces. And so that's what happened. So they eventually withdrew their forces, Britain, France, and Israel. And so what ended up happening was Egypt took over the Suez Canal. And one of the big things that starts happening afterwards is that it creates a lot of what ends up happening. It creates a lot of these Middle Eastern conflicts, because you start getting a deal where the Soviet Union starts backing a lot of these Arab states like Egypt, et cetera. And the United States starts backing Israel. And so it's later going to create these so-called Arab-Israeli wars that follow, of course, later. I did want to mention something that was kind of interesting in the Cold War. I guess it's kind of famous. They had this incident happen in 1957 that's well known. I think maybe October is when it was, I believe. But the Soviets, if you know about this, launched the first satellite in space. And this shocked, of course, the United States. It actually caused us to kind of redo a lot of our educational system, because we realized that maybe, the Soviets were ahead of us, especially with launching missiles into space. So that actually did several things. It scared us into building better nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons, which helped to create the Cold War more. And then it also created the space race too. So both those were things that were kind of a result of Sputnik in 1957. In fact, the Soviets put the first man in space, which was Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. And then 1958, also Eisenhower, because of this in the United States, created NASA, about that, which is our space program as well. And we would start launching, satellites, astronauts into space also as well. Like I think the United States, it was Alan Shepard and John Glenn. They were the first Americans to go into space. Although the joke in America was that they put a chimpanzee up first, named Ham, where they put a man up. Ham in a can or something like that, they called it. So anyway, just kind of briefly about that. That was another thing that was kind of famous, about the Cold War era. They got the space race going on, between the Soviets and the U.S. And, of course, the U.S. later put a man on the moon, of course, in 1969. Right. Then let's kind of move on. There's some other issues. I did want to mention this other incident that happened, too, that was very famous in the Cold War era. They had the U-2 incident that happened. That's kind of famous. It's like one of the big things that happened, I think, under Eisenhower before he went out. Then John F. Kennedy came in, the United States as president. And this was an incident where what happened was the U.S. and Soviet Union were going to meet at an upcoming summit, I believe it was. On May 1st, 1960, the Soviet Union shot down a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. They captured this guy named Francis Gary Powers, who was a CIA pilot. And this was a very big issue in the Cold War. It actually worsened tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets because they realized we were now spying on them, with U-2 planes. And I guess later we'll have satellites going over also the Soviet Union. So under John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, later presidents of the United States, we get all these tensions that of course occur, in the Cold War era and all of that. Then under John F. Kennedy, who was president from 1961 to 63, there were a lot of tensions that happened, of course, in the Cold War era that are very famous that I wanted to talk about. One, they had the so-called Berlin crisis that happened between 1960, it really went back to 1958, but 61 was the worst year of it that they had, like under Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev wanted West Berlin, wanted to take control of it, wanted the U.S. to withdraw forces. He wanted also us to withdraw nuclear weapons from West Germany and all that as well. And so I created this face-off between both sides, where both sides had forces and tanks that were looking at each other at the Berlin Wall. This is actually a picture here showing in 1961 the United States forces, and you got the Soviet forces over there with their tanks. And the reason why all of this happened, if you know about it, was because in 1961, as you know, the Soviets with East Germany began building the Berlin Wall. They started constructing this wall, which basically surrounds West Germany, and it was built to prevent people from leaving, the Eastern Bloc to the Western Bloc, because that was a way people could escape basically to both sides. And so I forget how many people died trying to cross. I think I know dozens tried to cross it and got killed, of course. But you can see the differences between both sides. On the left side, you can see there, that's East Berlin. And where all the graffiti is, you can see, is of course, West Berlin. So interesting about that, with that whole thing. So that's kind of some of the stuff that was kind of going on at the time. Other things that happened under Kennedy that were very famous, that's well known. Here's a picture showing the Berlin Wall near the Brandenburg Gate. But also another issue that caused a lot of tensions in the Cold War era, of course, was Fidel Castro. Previously in Cuba, what happened was Fidel Castro seized power in what became known as the so-called Cuban Revolution from 1953 to 59. And he overthrew this right-wing dictator that was backed by the United States named Fulgencio Batista. He had been backed by us. Also, the mafia had a lot of power in Cuba because they controlled a lot of the casinos, hotels. And that's your first time seeing it? Yeah, it's been around. There's a lot of documentaries, of course, made about it also as well. Of course, it's not, they tore most of it down, as you know now. But yeah, Castro, of course, very, very famous, of course, communist dictator, of course, who takes over Cuba. He, of course, was involved. There's different men. They have Raul, of course, Castro, who was ruler for a while, also of Cuba. You may have also heard of Che Guevara. He's right here. He became kind of this Marxist who was from Argentina that was also involved with Fidel Castro right here as well. He's kind of this icon. Actually, Castro's right here, excuse me. I think that's his brother, Raul, which is over here. And but basically, they become involved, of course, in Cuba. And so one of the big things that happened under JFK, if you know about this, they tried to get rid of Castro in this thing called the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a CIA plan that Eisenhower had developed in the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. And it was a CIA operation where they trained anti-Castro Cubans. Basically, they were going to invade Cuba, and they were hoping that all the Cubans would revolt and back them instead. It occurred on April 17th, and it failed. They failed to oust Castro. Castro became a big hero in Cuba, and so they were all captured, and so they weren't able to get rid of Castro at that point. So the whole thing was a big embarrassment, by the way, for John F. Kennedy. And what ends up happening, if you know later, was Castro was later backed by, the Soviet Union and Khrushchev because they really had no choice. They're not sure if Castro was really originally a communist. I know Che Guevara was and all that, but he basically later, backed the Soviet Union because he had no choice. Because other than that, they would get invaded and his regime would fall. So that's the other big thing that happened in the Cold War, which is real famous if you know about it, was they had the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis that occurred in 1962. And what happened was the United States discovered the Soviet Unions that brought in missiles to launch at the United States to possibly prevent an invasion. So they were trying to protect Castro's regime at that point. And it was found in mid-October from U-2 spy planes that flew over, of course, Cuba. And it went on for almost a month. I think October 16th to November 20th, 1963. It was on the U.S. and the Soviets with Cuba were locked in. It looked like World War III was going to break out. And it got so bad that in the UN, the U.S. ambassador to the United States, Adlai Stevenson, got in a big row with the Soviet ambassador over whether they had missiles or not there. I think he said something like, "I'm going to wait until hell freezes over for you to tell me that you got these missiles." And that became a big, big deal. I think the military under John F. Kennedy wanted to invade. Basically, it's what they wanted. But JFK was kind of smart. He realized that World War III might break out. And so what the U.S. did instead was they put a blockade, a naval blockade on Cuba to kind of quarantine them. They basically gave the Soviets, a choice, either break the blockade, cause World War III, or back down. That was pretty much what they did. Luckily, Khrushchev did back down. Yeah, I guess he blinked or whatever, and we prevented, World War III from breaking out. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was really the closest incident in the Cold War where we almost went to World War III. We became very, very close. My father actually was in the Air Force at the time, stationed in Florida when all this was going on. You had actually people digging fallout shelters and things like that in the United States, thinking that there was going to be like a World War III, that kind of deal. So people were really paranoid about that in the United States. So, but that was the peak of the Cold War. There were some other incidents later on the Cold War. I think under Reagan, there was another one where they almost had World War III break out, where I think the Soviets thought we had launched missiles, but we didn't. But other than that, I think the Cold War after that kind of starts to go more down and all that. Hey, Leslie, what's going on? Hope you're having a good morning out there also as well. Now, let me also talk about some other issues. I do have some other pictures showing, by the way, pictures. Here's a kind of a newspaper article, of course, showing, of course, the blockade, of course, of Cuba right there. But let me go ahead and move on to talk about the other big incident that happened also in the Cold War era, which was the Vietnam War as well. The Vietnam War is the other conflict, really, that was basically a hot war in the Cold War. It actually mostly occurred under Lyndon B. Johnson, but it went back all the way to the time of like Harry S. Truman when the Vietnam War started. It actually lasted about 30 years, 1945, 1975, Very unpopular conflict in the United States. Close to 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam conflict trying to protect South Vietnam in the war. It all happened, because of the domino theory, because we thought that South Vietnam would fall to communism, but it wasn't our fault. The Vietnam War was actually this conflict that was started by the French, because the French wanted to take over Indochina. It's called the First Indochina War. They fought this communist group called the Viet Minh that was led by this man named Ho Chi Minh, who you may have heard of. And Ho Chi Minh later was the president of North Vietnam. I'll get to him later. And what happened in Vietnam was the French eventually were defeated in northern Vietnam today, at a place called Dien Bien Phu. So they got encircled or something like that by the Viet Minh forces. The Viet Minh were these communist guerrilla forces. They were in Indochina. They were Marxists, and they were backed by Ho Chi Minh. And what happened was it led to the separation of Indochina into two states. You had these two states that were North Vietnam, which was communist, and you had South Vietnam, which was democratic capitalist. And they were divided at the 17th parallel. Kind of like North Korea was divided at 30th parallel, right? 38th one, the 17th parallel. And Ho Chi Minh was the president of North Vietnam for a long time. And Ngo Dinh Diem was also the president of South Vietnam. I think up to like when JFK's around, I know. So you got these two various states that are kind of, against each other. So that's part of, what they, of course, how it kind of started. Now, how the United States got in the conflict was because of an incident that happened in 1964 called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where what happened was a U.S. destroyer, which was up there in the Gulf of Tonkin near North Korea, supposedly got attacked. They call it the North Korean incident. Actually, two destroyers were attacked. They have this one called the Turner Joy as well, attacked by gunboats, the North Vietnamese, which they're not sure they fired torpedoes at them, but it may have been machine guns. I know that. And so the United States intervened in the war, and it became like a undeclared war. It was like a police action is what it was, basically, where the United States sent in forces. We initially bombed North Vietnam, but then in 1965, we started sending in land troops, of course, into the war. That accelerated the conflict, more or less. Actually, more bombs, if you know about this, were dropped on North Vietnam than all in World War II. We bombed them almost into the Stone Ages, some of their cities. And the Vietnam War was a very bloody war. I think the Vietnam today thinks that close to 2 million people died in the war. A lot of civilians died, of course. It was a very, very bloody conflict. And by 1968, the United States actually had 500,000, around 500,000 troops that were in Vietnam. By the time Johnson went out of office and Richard Nixon became president overall, you can see about 10% of the forces, I guess, were eventually killed. Like 58,000 actually died within about a 10-year period, more or less. The peak of and by the way, the Vietnam War has often been called the United States. They call it the helicopter war because in a lot of cases in the war, if you know about Vietnam, it's very jungle areas, mountainous areas. So they use helicopters, aircraft, to get troops around. They use a lot of, aircraft in the war as well to bomb, targets in North Vietnam and all of that. So it was often called the helicopter war. I think they also call it the 10,000-day war because it lasted that long in history as well. And we fought alongside the forces of what they call ARVN, which is what they call the military of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam as they called it as well. So they had forces that fought with us too against North Vietnam. So South Vietnam was democratic capitalist. North Vietnam, of course, was communist. The peak of the Vietnam War was the so-called Tet Offensive, which was in 1968. This was a major offensive battle that was fought in the war by the NVA, which is what they call the regular North Vietnamese Army, and what they call the Viet Cong, which was the VC, which was what they called Vietnamese guerrillas that were communists that were in the South. And it was fought around the Vietnamese New Year in January, February of 1968. And I think that's where the Americans lost their most casualties, I think, in the war. And what ended up happening was the United States people and the government kind of turned against the war. Like Nixon decided that we need to get out. And so he came up with this thing called Vietnamization, where we eventually withdrew our forces. And we tried to get the South Vietnamese, to fight alone. United States, of course, a lot of people protested against the war. A lot of people didn't want the draft. People were getting drafted into the war, especially college students. And so you had a lot of students and other people that were protesting against the war, created a lot of violence in the war. You had the civil rights movement also going on in the United States as well. At the same time, the 60s was an awful period, very turbulent period in American history, if you know about that. It's more American history, I know. But North Vietnam eventually took over South Vietnam in 1975, where Vietnam was unified as one state. And so that really ended the whole Vietnam conflict. So yeah, that's the so-called Vietnam conflict that they have overall. Here's kind of a timeline showing it, but we would actually evacuate forces 1973, 75, from there, right there. But that's one of those conflicts, one of those two big conflicts that were kind of a hot conflict, of course, that occurred in of course, the Cold War era. I'm going to kind of move on to also talk about, I kind of spent all the time talking about Vietnam. Yeah, there was a lot of atrocities in the war. I don't know if I'll talk as much about that, but, like the My Massacre, that was another reason why people didn't like the war, because some Americans committed atrocities, against the Vietnamese. And so that was seen as another negative, not just the war itself and why we're there. Because I guess Vietnam seemed like a faraway place that we were there originally. All right, let me move on. I need to talk about also, I guess, the end of the Cold War, kind of get into and talk about some of the major issues that were at the end of the war. Now, the end of the war, there's like a different issues that occurred that I did want to talk about that were there. Usually the end of the Cold War is part of a period that they call détente, that you may have heard about. Détente is a term they start using in the 1970s, which means in French, relaxation. And it was this idea to relax tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, East and West, and all of that. And so there are several things that happened that were kind of famous during this time. One thing was that the United States, the Soviet Union, began creating these nuclear weapons treaties. Like they had the SALT agreements that were made. SALT I agreement, I think, made in the 70s, where they basically limited their amount of stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Later, they had the INF treaty done in the 80s between Reagan and Gorbachev, which limited the amount of intermediate type missiles as well. They did that too, which I think that was one of the big things that helped to end the Cold War, was the INF treaty. I think in 85, I think it was, or 86, maybe 86. I think it was 1986 as well. Also, U.S.-Soviet Union began trading, like in the late 70s, I think, back and forth. Like we sent like wheat and other stuff to them as well. But the 70s was really a bad time. It wasn't a great time. Like I was a child of the 70s and 80s myself. And it was a period of what they call stagflation. That happened like in the U.S. and other countries where there was like really bad inflation. The economies were stagnant throughout the world. And a lot of it was because of the price of oil and gas went up. They had the oil crisis, energy crisis that happened in the 1970s, where a lot of it was caused by a lot of tensions in the Middle East, mostly because of the Arab-Israeli wars that were going on. And what happened was a lot of the OPEC countries refused to sell their oil to the Western powers, like the U.S. Like the U.S. had come in and actually started backing Israel openly, like in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where I think Israel was fighting Egypt and some other Arab countries that were backed by the Soviets. And so that basically is one of the things that I think initially they think that kind of helped kind of create things that were kind of bad, I know, economically. But we were trying to still at the same time trying to release some of that tension between us. They also had the Helsinki Accords, you may have heard of too. Those, I think in the 70s, where they tried to talk about civil rights and human rights, things between the East and the West as well, trying to better those also. Now, I did want to they talk about Ronald Reagan. It's really, they think of the United States, he was really one of the men that were instrumental in really, they think, ending the Cold War era. He was, of course, the 40th president of the United States, kind of a former actor, believe it or not, in Hollywood, but he became basically the governor of California, and he began to push a lot of conservative ideas. In fact, I think they talk about the Reagan Revolution, 1980s, that kind of made people be more conservative, like now. And so, like a lot of Reagan's policies, they think helped to end the Cold War. That's why he's very important, of course, Reagan. At the time when Reagan was in power, one of the major leaders of the Soviet Union was in power, which was Leonid Brezhnev, who was in power from 1964 to 1982. And Brezhnev was the second longest reigning Soviet leader after Stalin. And Brezhnev, by the way, tried to crack down on democracy. He tried to prevent the spread of capitalism. He also arrested people that were against the regime, the Soviet Union. They're called dissidents, if you know about this. A lot of people kept trying to leave the country. They called it defecting when they would leave, of course, and all of that. And Brezhnev was famous for basically enforcing what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was this policy where the Soviets came up with an idea to use force, military force, within Eastern Europe to prevent countries from going communist. There was a fear that if that happened, that would be the end of the Soviet Union and all that. And so that actually happened like in 1968. Yeah, they had the Prague Spring, you may have heard about, where in Czechoslovakia, they tried to create democratic reforms there. And so the Soviets sent in their military and they crushed it and prevented it. It's called Prague Spring and all that. And then they think also that the Brezhnev Doctrine was also used by Brezhnev, the Soviets, to intervene in Afghanistan because they were trying to support the Afghan communist government there in Kabul, that was their capital. And so in 1979, December, I think it was, they sent in forces there, and it started the so-called Soviet-Afghan War, which would last till, I think, 1992. And they talk about that, by the way, Afghanistan being what would be later. I think that was one of the causes of the decline of the Soviet Union. They kind of consider that to be the Soviet Union's Vietnam conflict, more or less. And Reagan backed a lot of these Afghan rebels that were more like radical Muslims that were against the Soviets. And you may have heard of Osama bin Laden, right? In the 1980s. He became one of our big allies, believe it or not. He attacked us later. And he had this rebel force called the Mujahideen, you may have heard of. And so under Reagan, I think under George H.W. Bush, they gave them military aid, and so that was another proxy war, Afghanistan, of course, in the Cold War. The other thing that Reagan did in the 80s, a lot of his policies helped to end detente. He started ending detente, got rid of it, in the 80s. And he mostly did this by expanding an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So he started stockpiling more weapons, building up our armed forces in the war. Reagan was the one who developed that Star Wars program. I don't know if you heard about the Star Wars program. It was this thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was this nuclear umbrella where they would have satellites in space that would knock down Soviet nuclear missiles. And this made it very difficult for the Soviets. They had to start spending more money on their arsenal and all that. And so it was something that maybe helped to cause the end of the Cold War. Reagan was the one that called the Soviet Union the evil empire. That was his nickname, he called them. And he thought it needed to be crushed, everywhere. However, Reagan began to meet, if you know about this, in the mid-'80s with Mikhail Gorbachev, who, you know about it, was one of the last rulers of the Soviet Union. He was premier 85, and I think 1990 to 91. He was actually the president of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 91, right there. And Gorbachev, by the way, he began making reforms to the Soviet Union that they think helped to lead to the end of the Cold War. And you may have heard of these famous things he came up, which were glasnost and perestroika that they have. And these were these two policies, which perestroika meant restructuring, where they tried to create economic reform with some capitalism. And then they also they tried to create what they call glasnost, which was like openness, where they gave people more freedoms, freedom of the press, and so on in society. And of course, they made a joke about it that here's a kind of a cartoon. So then they introduced perestroika and glasnost, and the whole damn country started to fall apart, of course. And so some people think that these reforms, by Gorbachev, actually led to eventually the end of the Cold War. So it did actually the opposite of what it did, basically. And in that famous picture there, Reagan later went to the Berlin Wall. I think it was his most famous thing that kind of happened, I guess, at the end of the Cold War, where he made it. I think it was in 1987. He made that famous speech where he told Gorbachev to tear down this wall. So that's basically, more or less the thing that's leading into eventually the end of the Cold War at that point. And there's other reasons why the Cold War ended. You put up a bunch of things, too, that you talk about as well. Like, well, obviously, the 1980s, things like democracy, capitalism became more popular. Poland had the Solidarity movement. There were movements in Hungary, basically, to get more democracy, capitalism. Czechoslovakia, Romania. I think they had the Velvet Revolution and all that happened, I think, down there, and all that. So all those things that happened, like Hungary opened its borders up with Austria, and so people could just pour in from east to west and all of that. Then the other big thing that happened that was very famous, was the Berlin Wall fell, of course, in 1989. That was the next thing, where they opened up basically the wall, and so people started going east to west into East Germany. And so in 1990, there was no more East-West Germany. Basically, both those states unified as the Republic of Germany now. And so that was the other thing. And then they had one more thing that happened too, that they say is like one of the main things that ends the Cold War, of course, is the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991 with Gorbachev stepping down. And so the Soviet Union broke up, as you know, and the Republic of Russia formed. So that pretty much ended the Cold War at that time. So they say early 90s is about, when the Cold War would basically end at that point. They do have the post-Cold War era, which I guess that really starts in the early to mid-90s that you have as well. Those are some of the major events, of course, that happened, of course, in the post-Cold War era. You, of course, got the Gulf War that happened, which, of course, the Gulf War was where Saddam Hussein in 1990 invaded the Kingdom of Kuwait. And so that involved the so-called Persian Gulf War, where a coalition of forces, the United States, Britain, etc., and also a bunch of Arab states, basically formed a coalition of forces in Saudi Arabia. They invaded Kuwait to save them. And it was called Operation Desert Storm. As you know, it's kind of considered one of the first, I guess, one of the first of the two Iraq wars, because the second Iraq war they have later, as you know. Besides the collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakup of Yugoslavia broke up after the war. That's why you have all these countries now in Yugoslavia, like Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia. So they're not together anymore. That happened under Bill Clinton when he was president. 9/11, of course, happened September 11th, 2001, where you have the attacks on the United States, World Trade Center, and the Pentagon, which was done by Al-Qaeda. And, of course, they think mastermind by Osama bin Laden, of course, in 2001. That's more recent, of course. War on Terror, of course, happened after that, where we fought in Afghanistan against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. And, of course, later under George W. Bush, we got, of course, involved in Iraq war, the second war, of course, most recently. And I guess COVID, is the more recent thing now. That's a kind of a major issue that we have, of course, going on now in the post, Cold War era as now. A lot of these are kind of like current events that most people kind of know about, because I kind of remember 9/11. Back when my first year of teaching, I was teaching when 9/11 happened. Kind of weird about that. That was like 20 years ago. So I've been teaching 20 years, since then. All that. That's a long time ago, God. So anyway, that's pretty much it lecture-wise, of course. Now, of course, a few announcements before I go. Of course, for the semester, don't forget, you have a lot of remaining assignments that you still have left, of course, for the semester. Don't forget, you've got that World War I Canvas quiz you need to wrap up. That's due tomorrow, Friday, looks like April 30th. I'll keep sending out announcements like I did the other day. I'll do that today and tomorrow. And then you've also got the final vocab due starting Monday, so you can start uploading that to the speed grader in Canvas. Also, the Veterans Project. Anybody still doing that? Try to get that to me. Try to get to me by the weekend if you can. If you need more time, let me know about that project as well. Of course, and the final exam will be open starting today. I think most of the final will be, like I said, on the rise of fascism in World War II era. I'll throw some few other questions on the Cold War era. We just didn't have enough time to do that. I think we needed 2 days to really get a full lecture on the Cold War era. But anyway, that's the bulk of the stuff that'll be on there. And I'll have like some kind of review later, maybe by tomorrow, on the study guide questions that will be kind of on the exam. So I'll probably record that and post that for you as well later. So that's it. I'll, of course, have an announcement later, maybe about the weekend, kind of talking about which students are exempt for the final exam. But if you have a 96% or higher, of course, going into the final, you will be exempt. Just like I said, make sure that you do, wrap up those final assignments that you have, especially the vocab and that final quiz on World War I as well. So that's it for the semester. I hope y'all had a great semester overall. I hope y'all have a great summer, of course, as well. And so that's it. Y'all take care. And of course, maybe I'll see you on campus, because I think in the fall, looks like we'll have some face-to-face classes, of course, as well. So y'all take care and like I said, have a great summer and all that. So see y'all later.